speaker. In proposition, we believe that the European Union is sometimes in competition with Russia when it comes to the sense of political atmosphere, your sense of sphere of influence, and we think especially for these Eastern European countries, Europe has some incentives to claim that they should help them to fight with the battle against the influence that Russia has, right? I will talk about three things, mainly which incentives European Union has about spreading democracy and making a bigger trademark and a bigger political influence. I will talk about why we think specifically Russia is such a threat and why there are now a lot of countries are financially dependent on Russia, but also still cultural a little bit dependent on Russia. And lastly, I will talk about why we think we should specifically give financial support, and why we think this is a legitimate thing to ask from European civilians, but also a legitimate thing to ask of these countries in order to build their own, right? But first, shortly about the plan, we think we should try to secretly subsidize these countries, right? So not openly to Russia. We think Russia will probably find out anyway, but we try to do it in a shorter way. And what kind of things will we stimulate and support? We think mostly infrastructure, maybe some building of institution and education, like the basic stuff that is needed in order for people to actually build their own thing and be independent in the long run, right? So let's start with the incentive of the European Union. I think one of the main things the European Union is built around is not only to prevent war between themselves, but also to spread the democracy, right? We think European believe in fundamental things like human rights, and we think we should provide opportunities for countries to get some more equality, especially when we are able to, right? We think we can greatly improve some of the poverty line standards that are in these countries, and we can greatly improve some of the humanitarian rights in these countries, because now there's some so now we want to enact and install these anti-Russian movements, right? Because now Russia is really asking them to listen to Russia and be like a dictatorship like Russia is themselves, and we think this is a bad thing, right? I think the people need the basics, like the basic food, the basic infrastructure in order to think for themselves, and I think under the current influence of Russia, they cannot. And then secondly, what is another incentive of European Union is just to become this bigger trademark, right? In the end, it's not only better for people in Ukraine and countries like that to become part of this more civilized and more welfare nation, but we also think that for people within the European, in the long run, it's better to have more trade partners, to talk more with people, to get more import and export more workers, and to get more IPs. And I think so in the long run, most European civilians also would like this. And then lastly, we think they will also create more political power because we are a bigger entity that can do the competition with China and America, right? So so that's basically the incentives. Then why specifically Russia is such a threat? Well, when we look at Russia now, we see that it's a really included kind of dictatorship, right? They act like, oh, we're quite democratic, but in the meanwhile they are really reinventing themselves and building a quite strong military nation, right? We see this in the action that Russia, for example, had against Georgia, and we see that a power like the president, like now you have Putin, but you never know which president will be next, and we think this one person has so much influence on the way they think that it will never be balanced if we don't control the people around us. Yes.
Do you think that you're likely to radicalize and entrench the pro-Russian groups when you feed into the rhetoric of the West coming in and butting in on a domestic issue that has been resolved organically?
Yeah, so our opposition is afraid of a kind of backlash, right? We think it's actually better to make the first step in this, right? Because we think Russia is already building up these feelings that the Russian alt culture may be better. We think it's better to actually actively engage with this in order to instead of waiting for the backlash to happen in itself. And we think if we're already there and we're already helping them to become a better nation, they are more likely to like our stand of view, and I think that's a good thing. So more about the threat of Russia. Well, we think, first of all, they're really a big influence on a financial matter, right? They control all the gas, and most of these countries actually rely a lot on the transportation of gas from Russia to Europe, right? We think in order to prevent these enormous dependency on Russia, we should actually financially make them other opportunities that they can make up from themselves. And we see, maybe Russia will react on that, and they will say, oh, we just got off the gas again, like they didn't do that before, right? But do you think in the long run they probably will not do that so much, right? Because if we provide enough financial needs that these countries can support themselves for at least a couple of years, then Russia in the long run will not have the incentive to not get any gas anymore, because that hurts their own income as well, right? We think these, especially because these countries are still in development, a lot of these countries still have some of the communistic past in their life that they need different kind of opinions, they need different kind of views.
Okay, so for instance, during the time of the Viktor Yanukovych government in Ukraine, should the European Union actually have stopped giving support in terms of infrastructure building, educational building hospitals, and just resume that only once a pro-European president got into power again?
What we are suggesting is supporting more when the movements are getting away, right? We're not closing all the movements when we feel that are a strong pro-Russian side, right? But we are actively engaging with the anti-Russian side and promoting that this is why we give you money, right? And we think this works in the long run, and we still believe in human rights, even if there is not such a strong movement, and we think this correlates quite specifically. Then on the specific ways of financially, already touched this a little bit on saying why the dependent sphere of these countries are a lot dependent on the gas. But we think it's also really legitimate to ask of the European civilians to actually be part of this, right? They are known to be have some solidarity to weaker countries, and we think they will like that we raise this country and make them enable them to become a great partner. Like we did this with Spain and other countries as well. We think this actually works quite fine. And we also think it's legitimate to ask of these countries to be for a short time independent of us, because in the long run we think this enables them to be more independent, it enables them to have a better future. So for all these reasons, and we also will talk more about the long run and the effects on stuff like cooking, for all these reasons we back these proposals. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you in the first place, my first point, that this move will actually radically and actually entrench the current conflict, which is ongoing, political matter, which is actually spilling out into the streets with violent protests, etc. And we do not want to increasingly entrench those views and keep those people from possible further diplomatic change later on. Second thing that I'm going to tell you is that we tell you that Ukraine, and as a specific example, that is the country that we're dealing with on this motion, is organically moving in the direction that we want. Generally, their movement will actually serve as a positive example for other continuing countries down the road who would like to actually join the EU. So just the rest of my rebuttal will be interwoven, but the one point that actually doesn't sort of work into everything else is this, the incentive structure of the EU overall. Yes, the EU does have an incentive to actually spread democracy. Yes, it is sort of a Western mindset. However, we do not actually achieve that means and go about it this way, in a very organic way. We if our mindset, again, if our mindset is to spread democracy as much as we want, or as much as we can, for this particular country, why would we want to actually push our Western and our quote-unquote liberalized opinion onto a country which is currently politically divided to a certain extent that some entrenched views would not actually see this as an organic change, and other views would not necessarily see it welcome, because we're just infringing on what is currently a much more domestic matter, a much more private matter. Why would we actually want to push our views and affect that currently existing organic change? I'm going to go and talk about that a little bit later. My first point. Let's just take a step back and sort of analyze the overall political issue, because we don't actually see that we saw that from side proposition. like right now there's currently roughly a 50-50 divide as far as like Ukrainian citizens like who want to sort of side more with Russia and Putin versus like Ukrainian citizens who want to side more with the EU, and like which sort of change that they want to domestically, holistically, organically sort of attain. We like with under this motion, the only thing that we like really attain is that we actually make the pro-Russia side more entrenched in their views. The polarization of views, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't actually help your side. It does not help the EU overall, but the further entrenchment of views like gives political proponents just like another like sort of platform to actually like help the debate in any sort of organic holistic fashion, again, which is moving on in that direction anyways. They only more just like fuel the flame for empty rhetoric. They can now like use this as a platform for building up like empty arguments that don't actually help like the divide between the Ukrainian citizens, just saying that like the common arguments that we've already seen in this political entrenched like arena, like the outsider, the West, like those guys are invading us, they're trying to like impose their values on our own structures. We cannot therefore have the ability to decide ourselves what is a political matter. Like therefore we are less valuable as a result. We think that we should probably take a step back and let this change towards our direction happen anyways. Moving on, like we do not want to just give Putin a random stance for rhetoric. The idea that, again, the West has always done this is like an increasingly entrenched rhetoric within these types of cultures, specifically within Ukraine. Like Putin, again, therefore seems like the good guy because he's going to just like, as a result, just get like all the positive sort of like backlash, because if we sort of just impose our random like narrative on this particular country and then further countries down the result, like down the way. Because we don't actually believe that, no thank you, we don't actually like, the ideal that they're sort of going to reach is that, well, we cannot actually achieve this ideal ourselves. We're going to be so entrenched in like our own political matters that we need help from the outside, or therefore like we cannot just solve this politically by ourselves. That's not very good and not very stable for a country. Again, one is that is more or less literally like rioting in the streets right now for like some of these matters. No thank you. Furthermore, like when we actually entrench those views, when we make like the pro-Russia side, just give them another sort of like a standing platform which to speak on behalf of, and we should just like fuel the fire of empty rhetoric and BS. Like what this actually creates is like it draws out the conflict. We can all sort of agree that the conflict happening in the streets right now is very, very difficult. No matter which side that the Ukraine actually falls on, we do not want violent protests in the street. That's sort of like that's where we stand. Drawing out the conflict is a negative aspect in that sense. So when we give political opponents an additional platform to stand on and fuel that fire of like empty rhetoric, like we do not actually make any positive moves towards ending that conflict and drawing it out like for what was previously a private discussion actually further hurts the issue completely. I'll take opening.
Yes. The EU at the moment is in a terrible crisis, and there's no prospect to coming out in the short term. Russia has a very short-term safe gas transport. Who are people going to look to if we do nothing?
Okay, which actually like moves you on to like organic change in general. Like currently the divide is shifting towards the EU. People in Ukraine and like the debate is towards like going towards the idea that listen, Russia, they have sort of a lot to offer. It's just mainly gas though. Like, and those gas stores will will sort of end at a certain time. It's basically just like a small nuanced one particular resource economic influence as opposed to the EU. Like continuously developing commercialization, continuously developing industrialization, like free movement, and like human rights and spreading democracy, etc., etc. So like we actually think that actual change is happening already more organically, and the current debate within the current like political framework of this country in particular is like already moving in that direction. So I want to talk about no thank you. Secondly, this idea of organic change, how it happens a little bit more as opposed to the West. Again, what these like political proponents will sort of like pick us as and like say that we are. The West just imposing their views onto just, you need, democracy in our idea, because you clearly can't fix this issue on yourself. Like, what is domestically a private issue is not something that you can actually deal with, like, more or less. Organic change. We are, again, moving this way anyways. Like, we're polarizing the fight, which actually makes it, like, them versus us. Currently, because of the political divide, people are actually engaging in, like current holistic discussions. Like the idea is that should we actually engage with Russia, who has substantial gas deposits, or the EU, which can offer us long-term sustainability? Like that's the debate that we want happening. That's the organic change that is currently happening. If the EU certainly tries to tip the scales in any one direction, unfortunately there's no necessarily identifying factor that says that scale will be tipped in our favor. However, we can definitely ascertain that it will be used by the opposition to sort of use it as a launching platform for views which challenge our own, which views that are actually not in our very best interest. Reasonably, Russia can only offer gas again, and choosing that economic insight, choosing that particular economic influence, entrenches those particular views, the rhetoric completely just fuels, again, that fire. The Ukraine, again, furthermore from that, as Daisy's going to tell you later on, the Ukraine actually, in that sense, serves as a sort of example for emerging countries who want to actually engage with the EU. We're talking about engagement, not necessarily joining, not necessarily diplomatic relations, the level of engagement that we actually want to achieve. And we only achieve this by allowing the political system that is undergoing current change to actually enact itself and let them fix their own fights, because it's moving our way anyways. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just pause you for a minute and we'll have the listen.
Just
oh. I'm sorry about this. I hope it's... Yes? It's working. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's really great to be here. Sadly, the first opposition is not really good today. So, what I'm going to do is give a couple of arguments. First of all, what I'm going to explain is how this case of Ukraine, what they bring, where they believe in organic change, isn't happening at all, because they say organic change is nice, and we kind of agree, but they never gave us any argumentation why organic change is likely to happen. And second of all, I'm going to explain how this is a short-term strategy for the EU, and because Putin's relies on gas and gas kind of politics, which isn't sustainable in the long term, but is actually, as the European Union is in a crisis right now, a very efficient strategy to convert Europe to a kind of authoritarian Russian-style state in the short term. Right. So how does this play out? First, one point of rebuttal that isn't interwoven. So, what they say is that the moment that you give more funds to anti-Russian movement, this will actually make the debate in society more violent and will make the Russian side of the debate more pitched against them. First of all, we see that the debate in the status quo is already pretty polarized, right? The people that are going, that in Ukraine are fighting on the streets right now, that is the status quo, right? If we give some funds to them, we are strengthening this side, but we don't believe this makes a significant impact on the kind of polarization that is in society in Ukraine right now. We believe that is actually the status quo. But second of all, if we see that the prospect for Ukraine would possibly be to fall back into authoritarianism like Russia has, we believe that the people of the Ukraine have a very legitimate right in order to fight for democracy and fight for what they want in order to achieve this goal. Because we believe that if you in the long term are a democracy, you have freedom, you have justice, you have all the kind of economic benefits and nice things, while if you fall on the Russian side of the debate, you will come under an authoritarian state. We believe that as the EU is something we're fighting for, and showing this is also something that is very good for the legitimacy of the EU. So, talking about Ukraine. So why do we actually have to act right now, and why we have this gigantic window of opportunity to do this? First of all, at the moment, the European Union versus Russia is kind of balancing toward Russia, right? Why is this? At the moment, the EU has been in economic crisis for about 5 years, right? And there's no real prospect of us coming out in the short term, right? This means that for people who are looking to for stability, they're obviously going to look for a partner that offers this stability in the short term. What does this mean? If you look towards the EU, you have no guarantee whatsoever that the European Union, at least in the minds of the Ukrainian people, will actually recover. We see that what Russia right now has is an economy based on gas. And the demand for gas at this moment is pretty high, so that means that Russia, as long as Putin is alive and there's some gas in the ground, they have money to offer to the people of the Ukraine. This means that if you are looking as a person for stability, which is basically the primary thing that you're looking for the moment that you are in a certain society, especially if you are living in the east of the Ukraine, you're probably pretty poor and don't have much things to go around, you're first going to look for the partner that offers the most stability. And in the status quo, the partner that offers the most stability is sadly Russia. Even though we are pretty stable as well, but Russia are much more stable as well. But go tell that to a poor farmer in the east of the Ukraine, right? So that is why these people also look to Russia as much. And then they say, yeah, organic change will happen because they will see that democracy is good on the long term. And what this means is that if they see how great democracy is, like you're building hospitals and building infrastructure and that kind of stuff, they're suddenly going to convert to democracy. The problem is, this is simply not happening, right? This is actually what we want to do. We want to fund these movements in order to give them some capital, in order to do good things for society. Because at this moment, what these anti-Russian movements are basically saying, Putin is bad, authoritarianism is bad, but our alternative, we don't really have it because we don't have money, right? So the organic change towards democracy, like the country will suddenly economically develop itself, without any outside influence, we believe that that is the actual thing that we are going to achieve here, and that is why we should fund these movements in order to give these movements an opportunity to actually do something for these people and make these people see that democracy is a very stable alternative as well. And we also have a very short window of opportunity to do this, because the moment that Ukraine will see becoming a democracy and will lean more towards authoritarianism, we see there is no real way back, right? We see that Russia basically has been lost for the democracy project, while after the Cold War in the 1990s, everyone thought that we could turn Russia into a lively democracy, right? We failed to do this, they ceded back into authoritarianism, and now it's too late. We have to make sure that Ukraine doesn't walk down the same path. Michiel.
Yes, so I mean, if this whole idea of this very short window of opportunity and indigenous movements not actually getting any foothold, how is it possible that over the last few decades in the status quo, the use of developmental aid regardless of the color of any government in there, and still a lot of countries have actually shown a pro-EU leniency? Why is this proposition so necessary for that?
I don't see this whole pro-EU leniency that you say, right? After the Cold War, in the short term, people were thought, now everything is becoming great, now we are going to join the EU. But after 20 years, for the people in Ukraine, not much has changed because they have had no actual economic development there, right? So for them, they are actually turning more towards Russia and less to the EU, because this gives them much more stability, right? And how does it intertwine with Putin's dictatorship, and why is this more a short-term strategy than a long-term strategy? We see, first of all, Putin's government relies mainly on Putin, right? And Putin is almost 60 years old, so Putin, right, in a couple of 10, 15 years, Putin will most probably die, right? Second of all, his political capital is mainly based on gas. The problem with gas is that you have to make long-term investments in order to change who you trade with, right? Russia can't just say we won't trade gas with you anymore, because you cannot instantly make pipelines to other areas in the world where you can transport gas to. But what this means is that there always has to be a long-term strategy to turn away from the EU. I believe this is certainly not that harsh of a measure that they will actually do this, but if they will do this, the EU can do exactly the same, get more infrastructure with the Middle East in order to get gas from there, and in the meantime, it's not unlikely that Putin will die, the government will collapse, and we can win Russia for the EU back again. So, because we have explained to you why there is no organic change in the Ukraine, and why we have to support these people and actually to achieve this change, and second of all, why this is a short-term strategy and Putin's dictatorship is not as strong as we think, but it is on the short term with the European crisis, please vote proposition. Thank you.
The goal for Ukraine, and I clarify that we speak of Ukraine because that's where we can see something tangibly happening in a way that we can identify, and we've all pretty much conceded that that's the battleground, as it were, and winning that battleground eventually then leads on to influencing all the neighbouring areas and serving as an example. So that's why we set this primarily in terms of our response, in terms of our tangible discussions at Ukraine. Right. The goal is a move towards the EU, is a move towards both in terms of economic relations and eventually then social, cultural and value relations. And it's also towards maintaining a functional relationship with Russia. That is the ideal. We tell you that none of those things happen because of, none of those things happen that are actively hampered because of their proposition, right? In that then, we bring you 3 things. We talk to you again, because it didn't seem to quite understand what I brought to you, about why it is that there is organic change happening, and why it is that you necessarily damage that change long term and short term. We talk to you then furthermore about what you do and how you damage the bridge that is necessary between EU and European values, and also Russia and Russian values, and interacting with them. A diplomatic channel and the mediating channel is something that we need, and they destroy that. And finally, we talk to you about what you do to the internal national identity of quite a split country when you polarize the argument, when you pick a side, and when you say that a defeat means a defeat against that identity. Right. Before that, though, one main point of rebuttal. They bring us this issue of stability, right? And they tell us that the economic future with the EU is long-term good, but short-term, and when you look at it from the surface, is quite unstable. Whereas Russia is long-term bad, but short-term, when you look at it, is quite stable. We say that's just necessarily not true for a couple of reasons. Why? We tell you that on our side of the house, we have small, incremental, very tangible measures like trade and trade agreements and increased ways of moving goods around, like mobility of persons and people being able to move around and get work elsewhere and bring money back into the system. And thirdly, also gas. The one thing and the only thing that Russia has to offer right now is gas. I'll shut off your gas. We say, though, that the future of gas moving east towards Ukraine is not one that's intangible, it's not one that's inconceivable, it's one that we already actually have the means to do. It's one that's increasingly very much going to be the status quo if Ukraine would take it. And so we tell you that the only thing that Russia has is already not good enough, and it's very clear that we have very clear stable short-term and stable long-term to offer in this side of the house. And we'll also talk to you about why it is that the people in Ukraine do recognize that, right? So we tell you that the stability point just doesn't stand. They talk about the crisis and that being the reason the EU it seems unstable. So that crisis is specifically linked to the euro and is already accepted as specifically linked to the euro, something that's not even remotely on the table for Ukraine, not now and not in the near future. So that crisis is not going to affect them. They can recognize that's not what they're buying into right now, which means that also doesn't stand. Right, so we talk to you about why it is that we say they're moving in that direction, because they tell us we don't bring them any evidence or any analysis on this. Tell you the Orange Revolution, tell you the election of Yushchenko is that exact moving in that direction. You see that the reason, like Yanukovych coming back into power, wasn't that we just decided we're now anti-EU after having been enough of a majority to elect a pro-EU person in the first place. Tell you that move was more about the splitting of the base between Tymoshenko and Yushchenko, and not actually moving away from EU values. See, there was enough of a majority for the Orange Revolution, there was enough of a majority for installing a pro-EU person. That majority has not gone away. The reason we know that majority has not gone away, because we see millions of people on the streets protesting the attempt to move away from the attempt to move away and move back to Russian. So when they tell us that that there isn't enough of a majority, there's no organic movement towards this, that's patently not true. Otherwise you wouldn't have over 1 million people protesting at the moment. Also, why do we tell you more clearly that millions of people are moving towards, right? We also tell you because what is on offer are very tangible, very easy to compromise on goals for the moderates and the culturally pro-Russians, because it's things like tangible economic benefits that don't necessarily mean buying into entirely the notion of the EU identity or the European identity, but more so specifically incremental tangible things that you can buy into even as a moderate. So you do see more and more people moving over. The majority that initially was responsible for the Orange Revolution, as responsible for installing a pro-EU government, that majority is ever growing and ever increasing. So to tell you necessarily that organic change they tell us is not happening and doesn't exist, it's patently untrue, right? So we tell you that what do you do then when you try and involve yourself in an organic movement that's already happening? We tell you that you radicalize the other side, because even if it's the thinnest veneer that we place on this fight as being about Ukrainian future and what's best for Ukrainian future, the best version of the Ukrainian future we want, even if it's the merely thinnest veneer that allows us to pretend that's what the fight's about, that at least means that you can have people moving over to our side. When you radicalize that fight, you necessarily make it a proxy battle for EU versus Russia. It means that you entrench the people who are on the other side of that. You make the pro-Russian groups necessarily have to be against you, because now it's about specifically, you explicitly say this is a battleground for EU versus Russia. Then you polarize those groups, you separate them, you make it more difficult for the moderates that we've seen moving over to our side because of the tangible economic benefits we have on offer. You make them more like the state on our side, you radicalize it, you draw the conflict out longer, you skew the discussion away from the ways in which we can benefit Ukraine, and you make it so that fight just doesn't end in the near future. And that's how you damage the organic movement that we've told you, have proven to you is happening anyway. Right. Thirdly then, not quite. We tell you that these countries, like if things go the way they are, like Ukraine and other such countries will serve as a very important link for us between EU and Western Europe values and also those of Russia. Because the point at which they tell us Putin is bad, as just that thing that we can say and damn him, like we don't have to interact with Putin and Russia every day on the international stage, like we don't have to compromise them, like we don't have to have diplomatic links with them. And they tell you that they could just damn Putin is bad and Russia is bad. So that's not true. I think that's the opposite of what it is that we want to do. I'll take closing.
Throughout this debate, we've been sort of pretending the fight, the discussion in the Ukraine is completely level. It isn't. It intimidates journalists. It locks up opposition politicians. This is not a fair fight. We need to counteract that.
We tell you the point is that we're moving in the direction that we need to. We tell you that your involvement stops that, entrenches that, means that more of this happens because you radicalize the response to the pro-EU group necessarily, because now you make it not able to pretend that it's a fight about pro-Ukraine and pro-Ukrainian future, but necessarily EU versus Russia. So all the things you say are bad happen more on your side, right? So we tell you that you mean that you make this fight about having to choose one way or another between being European, being EU, or being Russian. Not only does that damage our link necessarily between the Western values and between Russia and still being able to have some sort of relationship with Russia, it damages the national identity, because now it means that the people who lose, as it were, have no buy-in back into the society you create afterwards. They necessarily are more resentful because you say that the loss and the movement towards pro-Europe against pro-Russia is a direct attack against their identity, that Russia was bad and pro-Russia sentiments are bad, so they're bad and the good guys have won now. That's a sort of divided society that doesn't come together to work necessarily for economic benefit, for movement, for greater progress. That's a sort of that's a society that we still see clashes happening further on down the line consistently. So for all of those reasons, because you damage the organic movement that's happening, because you damage our necessary link to Russia in the near future, and because you damage that country's and long-term ability to unite, for all of those reasons we bring you to a close.
Yes, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. So I'll just start with one piece of rebuttal, then I'll be moving on to telling you why, as my colleague has already said, we believe that there's an undemocratic influence in these foreign companies, and it's important for the EU to address this balance. I'll also be telling you how this actually materially helps political parties, prevents this backlash which we've been talking about, and my main real point throughout all of it will be how it brings about this balance, which we find to be the most important thing in this debate. So just to start with, there's this idea that's coming from this side that we're forcing this fight to be about EU versus Russia in the Ukraine, and no, this fight already exists within the Ukraine. We're not going in there and creating this. This already exists, but with a massive Russian bias. So what we're doing is we're actually addressing this balance, and that's what I'd like to move on to now. So we're talking about in the context of an undemocratic influence, within these surrounding countries from Russia. What we find the EU needs to do, and it's in the EU's interest to do, is to address this balance. So Putin and Russia fund and support these surrounding companies. They fund and support the political elites And
Given that Yanukovych is on the verge of being forced out by the current protest, by the current push that's happening, and there are already pro-EU, the two heavyweight boxers whose name I forget, like people waiting in the wings to move in, how is it that this organic change we tell you is happening is not happening?
we're not saying it's not happening. We're saying that we need to provide a level playing field for this to actually happen instead of having an undue Russian influence within these areas. So what do Russia bring to these people? They bring trade, they bring financial support, they bring consultation support. You know, due to this, these movements which are pro-Russian and prevalent within these areas, unduly prevalent, they maintain their support. They get funding for their media campaigns, they get cheap gas prices, etc. You know, this perpetuates the political elites in these countries who continue to discriminate against the minorities in their areas. So it's important for the EU to address this balance that is desperately needed in this region. So, you know, and under this model, both the EU and Russia will be engaging in this action instead of just Russia. It's not currently a level playing field. You know, pro-Russian groups have this influence and are increasingly pushing for an undemocratic state. So what we're doing is we're making it more level. No, thank you. So, you know, Russia previously rigged elections. You know, Yanukovych put Tymoshenko in jail. There's intimidation of journalists. There's all these things that Russia is doing, which, you know, aren't happening for these other groups. We're having this awful influence from Russia in these areas, especially Ukraine, as this is all famous. So these corrupt elites in these countries gain financial and political support. So how do we, yes?
Okay, well the thing with Tymoshenko is that she split the base and she also was sort of a crook anyway, so we're not entirely sure that they push her in jail. What we're saying though is the response from the people is still moving towards, so the imbalance you see in the pro-Russia bias doesn't exist and isn't true.
I mean, I find it completely amazing that you can say that this imbalance doesn't exist. I mean, like, we can all agree that Russia, you know, have this influence. You know, they intimidate journalists, they provide financial support from these areas that aren't otherwise coming from Europe or other areas. So what we need to do is be pushing and providing this influence to be moving towards Europe so we can provide that balance. So how do we materially help these political parties and prevent this backlash? So, you know, as happens from Russia at the moment, we help them fund their media campaigns, we help them fund their infrastructure. You know, they get full-time members of staff. Parties can dedicate more resources and more time, which the parties that are opposing these areas are already doing because of the influence they're getting from Russia. As I've said, levelling the playing field allows for these political parties to gain more influence and support from these countries. It provides, very importantly, this level playing field within the political spheres of these countries. So why do we think this won't provide the backlash which we're talking about, which seems to be very special in this area, is only happen when the EU get involved? So it's coming from the people in these countries. It's not some EU representatives rocking up in these countries and saying, hey guys, come over to the EU. What is actually happening is we're funding the political movements within these parties. These aren't external political movements. These are movements like in Ukraine, already existed, already have the support of people within the country. Maybe they weren't the political elites in those countries, but they're still people in those countries who can provide this fair and balanced support. So it gives these people legitimacy because they are the citizens of these countries. They can better argue to the people of these countries how the EU's influence helps them day to day and therefore garner more support. So these are still Ukrainian political movements making these points. We're talking about the contacts, as I say again, of opposing groups who gain huge support from Russians. You know, we're told by this team that the Orange Revolution, you know, were split because of the EU. We think that this is because they were already in this weakened state because they don't have a large amount of political support because they don't have equal funding or, you know, an equal balance in terms of their external support from Russia or from the EU. Thank you. So there's no stability within these groups. Thank you. The lack of stability in these groups because they don't have the infrastructure, because they don't have the financial capital, makes them more susceptible to these sorts of splits that otherwise wouldn't affect the groups that are supported by the Russians. So, no, thank you. So the last part I'd like to come on to is, you know, how this stops Russia from being more powerful in general. So the problem that we see here is that when Russia feel powerful, they begin to act in ways which are against the interests of the EU. So when Russia feel particularly powerful from their regional base, they start to rise gas prices, they feel more comfortable doing that, they can delay conflicts, as we've seen in Syria, they can conduct arms deals that negatively affect the interests of the EU. Yes, please.
That is more specifically when Russia feel on attack, when they feel defensive, when they feel paranoid, which you necessarily do when you say, when you involve yourself in saying Russia's bad.
I'll explain to you why I believe that this would happen when they feel more comfortable in the region with this regional support that still exists without this balancing in these regional areas. So they feel more comfortable when they have the support because they have less fear of the effects of reprisals from the West. You know, if they go against their interests, if we do less trade with them, we have worse relations, they feel more comfortable with this because they can rely on this basis of support in the region. They can continue trading in that region. They can
continue relying on the financial support that they get there. So they can rely on those countries. You know, currently these countries who continue support, you know, due to lasting cultural connections, due to political elite being financially incentivized by the influence of the Russians, and they continue to legitimize these actions because they're not scared of any effect from the West. So because we believe that, very importantly, we need to provide this balance which otherwise doesn't exist, and because we believe that this will actually materially help political parties and it doesn't provide this backlash which we're hearing from this side, we beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We believe the proposition runs counter to the ideals of the European Union and fundamentally underestimates the intensive blowback that will result from going with proposition side. I want to bring you two main points, the EU legitimacy and its ideals, and the underestimation of blowback that has been happening across proposition bends. Before that, I'll go to virtual, which I'd like to start off with a direct quote of the member of government. He said, "We're not saying that it's not happening, this slow transition, but we need to provide a level playing field to make it happen." So there's a tension in that phrase, isn't there? Because there's this idea that apparently there is some change happening, but we need to make it happen. No. The reason why change has been happening so far is because the level playing field is already there. Sure, Russia had some kind of support for pro-Russian parties, but mostly we countered that influence by, for instance, having NGO support movements from pro-European movements. For instance, George Soros's NGO massively supports political infrastructure that creates things like debate, both in Ukraine and Georgia, has also done so in Serbia in the past. So we actually believe that this level playing field already exists. And we didn't really feel that there was much more analysis coming out of the second government other than saying that Russia is some kind of evil mastermind that controls all political parties, even though apparently we've also had many pro-European, pro-Western governments over the past few decades in both Georgia and Russia and Serbia, despite all this supposed Russian influence. Okay, so on to my constructive. So we believe that the EU is more than any other nation or more than any other political power entity in the world based on some kind of ideals. And the ideal and the basic legitimacy of the EU consists of respecting the national sovereignty of nations. National sovereignty is a pillar. And the EU has been giving funds to the national to nation states over the past few decades, regardless of which government was in charge. As long as there was some kind of more or less functioning democratic framework, such as we have seen in Georgia, such you have seen in Ukraine, such you have seen in Serbia over the last 15 years or so. And this has always been the case. So lure the way for the EU to lure in potential candidates. And this is a direct result of EU ideals, because national sovereignty is key to an intergovernmental organization such as the EU. And this is because people like to be able to control their own internal affairs, right? This is something that we have seen over and over in the past decade of European Union internal politics with referenda about the European Constitution, where we have seen that people are still very much appreciative of national sovereignty in the framework of a nation state. And even even within the EU, it's actually not done by the EU to subsidize pro-European political parties to hamper the effects of Eurosceptical parties. And the idea here is that the EU actually create a kind of backlash that doesn't reinforces Eurosceptic rhetoric, because it just shows them like, oh yeah, see, that European hegemon is in fact trying to influence our system. So this will reinforce this idea that the EU only goes for its own interests, regardless of what national what people want in their own discourse. And the interesting thing is that we have this idea where, from the proposition side, where they say, yeah, I mean, we have to keep these people into the EU. We have to get them in the EU. That's the best thing that you can ever do. And the interesting thing about this is that this is not actually a done deal. There's a lively political discourse, lively narrative within these countries, such as Georgia, such as Serbia, such as the Ukraine, where there's definitely a political fight going on. And we don't think that it's congruent with the ideals of the European Union to respect internal sovereignty, to respect the internal political discourse on choosing whether to join the EU or not. And so, it decreases the legitimacy of the claim of the European Union as this system of intergovernmental organization that is both that is good for nation states, both inside and outside the EU. I'll take first.
Yes, of course there have been European governments in Ukraine and Georgia in the past 20 years, because until 5 years ago we were the shining beacon of stability in the world. This window of opportunity has been closed and we have to act upon that.
So just because we have an economic crisis, suddenly our human rights record doesn't count anymore. Suddenly our championing gay rights, suddenly our championing of human rights in the European Council, everywhere in the world we support human rights activists. Suddenly this doesn't count anymore simply because we have had a little bit of GDP loss. We don't really think that it works this way. We think that the appeal of the European Union works in more subtle ways, even though of course economics is a major part of it. But like we've already explained on opposition side, the economic and actually propositions set this themselves. In the long run, the economic advantage lies with the European Union. So we don't really see how this point actually falls on proposition side. No, thanks. So underestimating blowback. That's my second point. Proposition definitely underestimates this, both for the EU and for the former Soviet nations. So first, the EU. First for the EU, right? We need Russian support. We can pretend that Russia is not a player anymore. That it's on its last legs. That it's just some kind of gas producer. But this is just plain bullshit. We need the Russians on the international stage. We need their support in the Security Council. We need their support in diplomatic efforts concerning Iran. We need their support in for instance, finding a solution for the Syrian conflict. And we have actually seen that Russia, as long as we don't directly antagonize it, is willing to cooperate with the EU on these issues. But the moment you start portraying yourself, you start pretending you are a direct enemy of Russian interests, you destroy this détente that is currently existing, which provides a framework for working with the Russians on international affairs. Moreover, because we are interfering with political discourse, it will seem like we're actually not respecting human rights as much as we pretend to do, and this will we will have some spillover into other areas of human rights fights, such as, for instance, LGBTQ interests, where the Russians won't respect our ideals as much anymore, because they will see that we are actually kind of hypocritical about putting our money where our mouth is, because we're simply not supporting our own ideals when we have other interests. Moreover, and this is something you're not going to write down anymore, but the EU can't actually, the EU can't actually support prospective countries as much as we like to. For instance, we go to Georgia into trying to take South Ossetia. The Russian bear will have none of it. They simply smashed the Georgian government, so we don't want to give false support. Therefore, for all these reasons, because it's illegitimate, because of the weakness of the government, we back to
She's not going to win. She's not going to work. Oh. Okay, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be looking at, what am I going to be looking at? I'm going to be looking at, first off,
kind of the problems, the main problems that we see in terms of Russian influence, both within these countries, but also in terms of what that influence within those countries then means for Russia in the world. That's going to directly catch with the second point. I'm not speaking a little bit what he said. I'm going to look at how we think that this actually helps the political parties that we have, and then I'm going to be looking at this kind of backlash or effectiveness point. I mean, this is kind of really where the debate falls down, and I'm going to be looking at why actually it isn't a level playing field at the moment, why I think it's perfectly legitimate to get involved in that problem, and to sort of level the playing field, as it were. Okay, so what are the benefits, or what are the problems, and therefore the perceived benefits we have when we enact this policy? I think the first is that we recognise that Russia is simply undemocratic in the way that it operates. In many instances, right? We've seen Russian journalists killed, we've seen journalists intimidated, we've seen that it rigs polls, we've seen it allowed, and it's perfectly happy as well in terms of its dealings with other countries, for those countries to do those things, and to support it in doing them, right? That's one problem. That's going to be sort of the big finale. We've also got two additional things. One, that actually these countries simply being in the EU is beneficial for us, right? It's good for trade. It means that we have a wider trading partners who trade more with us. That's something we should absolutely go for. Something we should actively try and pursue.
Sure.
Thank you. And lastly, that actually that Russia simply being stronger in itself and having more allies is itself dangerous. Because Russia doesn't, and I think there's quite an egotistical view of Russia from the West. That kind of Russia just kind of does things to piss off the West. Russia's just kind of like the troll of the international scene. But that's not what it does, right? Russia acts in its own self-interest, and it does that time and time again. It doesn't do things in Syria to piss us off. It does them because it benefits Russia. The more powerful Russia is, the more able it is to act in its own self-interest. The more allies it has to turn towards Russia, the better able it is to pick up other allies in, say, Central Asia. Right? The more able it is to throw its weight around in international disputes, the more able it is to use things like its gas reserves to threaten people. Right? So that's the danger that happens. It's not simply that if we're nice to Russia, they're nice back. Right? That's not how it works. They aren't looking to be nice to us or whatever. They're looking for their own self-interest, and that often, as we've seen time and time again, involves sending tanks into places like Georgia. It involves rigging elections in other countries. It involves doing very nasty things. That's the problem of having a strong Russia. Not that they kind of go, oh, well, the West are being nasty, so let's do something to piss them off. That's just not how it works. No, thank you. So how do we actually help in this? Well, first off, aside from sort of infrastructure in terms of schools and things like that, presumably we just whack a massive, big EU flag on the side of everything. Stones all the EU stuff, and we hand out candy with little black EU things on to make people nice. But we also give it to the actual political parties, right? And this helps them massively, right? It means they have simply more money to organise themselves and be effective. To have media campaigns, infrastructure, have polling, which costs a lot. Members of staff, consultants to look at their strategy in terms of how they present themselves, right? Notice that data tells us that one of the major stumbling blocks that we had for the Orange Revolution was that actually there was a split within that movement, right? First off, notice that's more likely to happen in the kind of pro-democracy groups where these kind of splits can occur, rather than say where parties which themselves are going from an anti-democratic stance and are more likely to be hegemonic, monolithic entities where it's less likely to get splits. But notice she also points out that the effectiveness of a political party can influence the effectiveness of that political ideal. Right? So that when that political party split, when there are factions within the actual political elites going to be pro-EU, that had a negative effect on just people's perception of being pro-EU. So the less effective the party is, the worse that is in terms of the effect that we're going for. Right? So that's the benefit that we get from this. No, thank you. So let's look now at this backlash and effectiveness point, right? Because we aren't talking about perfect democracy where discourse is just fantastic, where everyone's able to speak their mind and it's just A-okay, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about places where there have been accusations of rigged elections, where we have seen politicians put in prison, or even if they did it, like the treatment of them, to this kind of medical treatment and things like that, has been quite intimidatory. And we've seen intimidation of journalists as well, right? And that's backed up by Russia. And the parties, and simply because Russia does those tactics the same way that those parties do those tactics. But notice as well that the elites, the
that do that have a clear incentive to stick with Russia, right? Because all of those tactics that they themselves do that keep them in power are things that Russia does, which Russia can help them with, which Russia just doesn't care if they do, right? That's very important because that shows that actually that we aren't on this level playing field. There isn't simply a free-flowing discussion, but the game is rigged in Russia's favour. We need to rig it back. Yes.
Okay, unnecessary explicit polarization of the issue moves Russia off our frenemy list to our enemy list, and also radicalizes the pro-Russia groups enough that necessitates more Russian involvement, so more of the stuff that you're complaining about, whereas we allow for the change that's already happening to just move to its natural course of...
Well, okay, I mean, first off, it's just not true that, I mean, let's look at Ukraine, right? I mean, Russia and the EU is the game in town, right? That's the political conversation that dominates Ukraine massively. So there already is this polarization, there already is this split, there already are people who are pro-Russia and pro-EU, if not because there are, for example, say, ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So this is already something which has already polarized the political discourse. This is the main contention that exists within these countries. The idea that we're simply going to massively increase that is simply ridiculous. But moreover, what we see is that actually what we currently have is absolutely no ability to influence things, but what we can do is have massive political capital and able to use that to help those parties in a way that like, there's only so much more that Russia can do, but we kind of have that kind of low-hanging fruit of being able to get those parties up and running, kept together, or being more organised, right? What we also do is what this does already is people recognise that Russia meddles, right? Even pro-Russia people recognise that Russia meddles, right? So the idea that this will simply be seen as some evil force coming in simply isn't the case. Because we're already going to be having personalities and people who identify themselves as Ukrainian, who identify themselves as Ukrainian, who are pro-EU. We have the Tymoshenko's and the other one who's got poisoned due to name, I can't remember, right? Those people already exist. We have an organic Ukrainian movement, but we have it organised in the same way, that Ukrainians recognise, organised in the same way that Russia does it too. That isn't something which looks like a foreign force, that looks like organising a domestic, organic movement, and that's what we do, and that's how we benefit Ukraine.
Ready whenever you are.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker. In this debate, what essentially the government side has said is, let's interfere in Eastern European politics, tell them that the European Union is great, by secretly funding their political movements that are against Russia. What we think is that it, first of all, leads to a heavy anti-European discourse, because it will not be secret, as I will explain. And secondly, we don't think this is exactly what EU represents the EU ideas. And thirdly, we believe that that Russia will have a reaction to this, and that what the Croatian government said is essentially completely not what Russia is going to do. Good, so let's start by Russia. What they wanted to do was do secret funding. Like, nobody will notice. We'll do secret funding. No, it'll come out, as Roel already acknowledged in his speech. It will come out, and that's even worse. So what will Russia see? Russia looks at the former Soviet countries, and they see, oh wait, the European Union is trying to secretly fund parties against us. What? So what you're essentially doing is you're going to countries and you let Russia see that, okay, we do not dare speaking up to you, but what we're doing is we're funding parties to go against you. We don't think Russia's gonna like this. Russia is really not gonna like this. So no, thank you. I'll take you later, but on this point. What they said is Russia has gas and a nice position in the short term, and what they essentially said was, as long as Russia has a stable and strong position, they will be able to be a troll in the world and act in their self-interest. But what they said essentially was, Russia acts in their self-interest if they are a troll. And what is exactly in Russia's self-interest? Going against funding parties in these countries. So what Russian reactions can either be even more funding these parties, or just being an immense pain in the ass in the international society. We think that is quite a bad effect, and Russia will protect their self-interest, as colonial government argued, and their self-interest is in this case to go against the European funding if we if we finally put the plan of government to place. Jos.
Yes, our human rights and LGBT rights are very nice on the long term, but they simply do not appeal to the poor person in the Ukraine whose main concern is that he has a stable job the next month, and Russia in this case is their only hope. Unless we do so.
Well, I'm going to get to this in my next point on EU ideals. So what exactly are the EU ideals in this case? What we've heard on government benches, democracy and human rights are awesome and we should promote them at all costs in those countries. That was essentially their line. But what Michiel has argued is there are more goals to the European Union, and perhaps this is not the most efficient way to achieve these goals. So what we see is that the European Union is a union of nation states. They respect each other's sovereignty within the state. They do not interfere with each other's politics. They do not fund each other's political parties. And the European Union does not fund does not fund pro-European parties. But then what does the European Union do to Eastern European and former Soviet states? What they do is actually they make an appeal to these states, a very nice appeal. What we have seen in, for example, Poland is a country that has come to the European Union and they have profited greatly from the structural funds, for example. That is what is the appeal of the European Union. So the European Union is something that is very prominent in those regions, as Michiel has explained, and it brings the appeal of states actually coming by the European Union, and that appeal is very strong. And then we can demand things, and then they'll actually change. That is how the European Union actually influences stuff, while respecting national sovereignty, because the European Union can give a new, good future perspective to those countries, after which they can make the internal decision to actually go with the European values. That is how the European Union has always done it, and how it worked out pretty well, and works a lot better than actually interfering completely against all European ideals of national sovereignty and by funding those political parties. Close.
The reason that the EU doesn't interfere in the sovereignty of its member states is because those member states themselves have to be fully functioning democracies. That isn't the case in Ukraine. That's why we can meddle and make the lives of the Ukrainian people better.
The Ukraine might not be a completely perfectly functioning democracy like in the European Union. What we believe is that there is a form of democracy, and what we've seen is that there is a basis for certain pro-European moves, and there is a sort of level playing field, because also NGOs interfere there, as Michiel explained. So we believe that at this point, it is still completely against the European ideas to intervene there. First, so because of national sovereignty, and because they're not so completely anti-democratic and dictatorial as you portray them to be. Finally, political discourse and what are the effects in the states that are actually being funded. What we have heard from the government side is, okay, we're going to sneakily change the discourse because these parties are going to go in there and be bigger, and they're already polarized. What we have seen in the status quo is that at this point there is already a discourse that can lead to pro-EU revolutions. So the discourse already exists in politics, and it's more prominent and less prominent, I think, in some time. So the discourse exists, but it's not always in the same prominent place. We believe that because we know that it exists and it has happened in the past, we can see that there can be a certain organic change there. There can actually be a change towards the EU because the discourse already exists for the change. No, thank you. What will this plan? No, thank you, Josef. What will this plan actually do to change the political discourse in these states? What we have heard from opening opposition is that there will be a certain invader rhetoric. It's something we have also seen in the European Union. In a democracy, you accept the outcome of elections, and you do not accept you accept them as long as they're internal. But what do we see here? We see here that parties are being clearly funded by the European Union. They're funded by an outside actor. What you've seen, for example, in EU member states is that they started rebelling against the European Union because the European Union was imposing certain measures on them which they did not agree to. That is what the government is actually trying to do here. So there is a strong anti-invader sentiment will exist, and it also fuels the anti-European rhetorics in those states, because what the pro-Russians can actually say is, oh look, those people have been trying to sneakily change your value patterns, they have been sneakily trying to change the policy in our country. That is just completely off. We have seen this in many countries, that this is a very strong rhetoric. People then feel that they are being intruded, that their politics are being intruded, and that creates a discourse in which there will be even stronger radicalization of the pro-Russian parties. So what will happen is that these movements will actually polarize the political discourse in these states, which can lead to either violent protests or will lead to no definite outcome on the European Union or anything. So it's completely counterproductive also in the political discourse. So it's in Russia's interest to be playing glass to us if we apply these measures. Secondly, it's completely against European ideals because we do not recognize national sovereignty if we do this. And thirdly, because the political discourse will change for the worse. We are proud to oppose.